The ice didn't just crack that winter. It screamed. A long, tearing wail that rolled up out of the Blackwater Gorge and across the frozen valley like something alive was being torn in half. And maybe something was. Elowen Ashcroft heard it from her doorstep, one hand frozen on the storm shutter, and every hair on the back of her neck stood straight up. She was 24 years old that winter, the last of her line, and she had learned a long time ago. That sounds like that one meant nothing good was coming. Let me tell you about her, before the wolves, before everything changed. Elowen lived alone in a stone cottage near the edge of the Oakhaven marshes, where the forest went dark and the maps went blank. Her nearest neighbor was 3 miles off, and even that was generous, because the village of Kyle sat farther still, tucked in the crook of the mountains, where the frost couldn't quite reach. The villagers knew her name. They just didn't say it kindly. Wild Thing, they called her. Feral. The huntsman's strange daughter who talked to the trees and slept with a knife under her pillow. They weren't entirely wrong about the knife. Her father, Coran Ashcroft, had once been the master huntsman for the High Lords of the Eastern Reach. A man who could read a snowbank like a page of scripture, who could track a stag through a blizzard, and come home before the fire went cold. But something had happened years back, something to do with a lord's cruel order and a refusal Coran wouldn't take back. And a man who refuses the powerful does not stay powerful for long. So they took his title, his lands, his good name, and they left him a cottage at the end of the world and a daughter who watched him grow old and quiet and gray, until one spring morning she woke and he simply didn't. Elowen buried him herself under the big oak by the gorge, and she had been alone ever since, trading winter roots and cured pelts with a village that took her goods with one hand and made the sign against evil with the other. She had stopped expecting kindness from people. That was the thing you had to understand about her. She had stopped expecting it entirely, which is why, on that bitter afternoon, when the ice screamed, her first instinct wasn't to run toward it. Her first instinct was to close the shutter and let the world sort out its own troubles, the way the world had always let her sort out hers. Except the sound came again, and this time it wasn't the ice. This time it was voices, not human voices, not exactly. It was a chorus of low, resonant, agonized moaning, muffled by water and stone, a sound so full of suffering that Elowen felt it land somewhere below her ribs, in a place she thought had gone numb years ago. Something down there was dying. Many somethings. And God help her, she couldn't leave them to it. She grabbed her father's heavy logging ropes off their pegs, a pair of iron-hooked poles, her skinning knife. She threw her wool cloak over her shoulders, jammed her feet into her iron-shod boots, and she ran into the white. The forest blurred past her. Skeletal trees sheathed in milk-thick ice, groaning in the wind. Her breath came out in ragged clouds. Her heart hammered. And under it all, that terrible dying sound, pulling her forward like a hook behind the breastbone. When she reached the lip of the ravine, she stopped. And what she saw below emptied the air right out of her lungs. The ice shelf over the deepest part of the Blackwater had collapsed, caved in entire, and in the churning black slush water below, a pack of wolves was drowning. But they were not wolves. Not any wolves she had ever seen. They were massive, monstrous, 3 times the size of any timber wolf, with shoulders as broad as war horses and fur the black purple of a storm at midnight. Prehistoric. Impossible. The kind of beast her father told stories about when she was small. The kind she'd stopped believing in, around the same time she stopped believing in mercy. And they were dying right in front of her. The current was dragging them under the remaining ice, one by one, pinning them against the underside where the water met the frozen ceiling, and there was no air left at all. Some clawed at the slick edges, whimpering. Some had already gone still. Elowen counted without meaning to. 12. 12 of them. Her mind did the math a survivor's mind always does. 12 giant predators. Any one of them could take her head off with a single snap. She was one woman with a rope and a knife in hands that were already going numb. The smart thing, the safe thing, the thing anyone in Kale would have told her to do, was walk away. She anchored the rope to the oak. Because here's the truth about Elowen Ashcroft, the truth the villagers never bothered to learn. The world had spent 24 years teaching her that no one was coming to save her. And somewhere in all that cold, she had made a decision. A quiet, stubborn, bone-deep decision. That she would not become the thing that had hurt her. That she, at least, would come. She tied the hemp around the base of the ancient oak, cinched the other end around her own waist, and she went down the embankment with the iron pole in her fist. The first wolf she reached was a soot gray brute with panic in its violet eyes, thrashing, half under. She threw her second rope, looped it over that huge head, cinched it tight around the chest, and she leaned back with everything she had. Pull, she gasped, to herself. Pull, pull. 600 pounds of freezing muscle. Her boots skidded. Her palms tore open inside her gloves. Her shoulders screamed. And for one long, terrible moment nothing moved at all. And she thought, this is how I die. Dragged into the black by a beast I was trying to save. Then the gray wolf found the bank with one paw. And another. And it heaved itself up onto the mud, coughing black water, shuddering. And it did not attack her. It lay there, shaking, staring at her with an expression that had no business on an animal's face. Something almost like recognition. There was no time to wonder about it. She went back. The second was a silver female, dragged out by the scruff, her hind legs gone dead with cold. The third and fourth were twin black males tangled together in a submerged thicket, and Elowen had to pry them apart with the iron pole, hauling them up so hard she nearly popped her own shoulder from its socket. By the seventh, her breath was coming in wet, painful gasps. By the ninth, the skin of her palms had split all the way open, and her blood was staining the rope a bright, warm crimson against all that white. By the 11th, a huge, scarred brute that looked like it had walked out of a dozen wars, and lost pieces of itself in each one. She wasn't thinking anymore. She was just a machine made of pain and stubbornness. Throw the rope, lean, pull, fall, get up again. The 11th wolf clawed onto the snow and collapsed. And the 11 of them, the ones she'd saved, did not run. They did not fight. They gathered on the bank in a shivering half-circle, and they turned those impossible eyes on her. Amber, blue, violet, all of them fixed on the one exhausted human woman kneeling in the red snow. Elowen fell forward onto her hands, done. She was done. Her whole body was shaking now, and not from effort, the deep, violent shaking of a person whose warmth is running out through the cracks. Hypothermia. She knew the signs. Her father had taught her the signs. She looked out at the black water, ready to gather her ropes and drag herself home before the cold finished the job. And that was when the river gave up its last secret. Through the shattered ice, a final shape rose, and Elowen's heart simply stopped. Because this one was not like the others. This one was a titan, nearly twice the size of the largest wolf on the bank. A leviathan of black and frost, his coat a shifting weave of midnight velvet and stark white where the ice had crusted it. He rose out of the dark water like something out of the oldest stories, the ones told in whispers, the ones that end badly. But that wasn't what stole her breath. What stole her breath was that he was dying. A crossbow bolt jutted from his shoulder, heavy, black iron tipped in gleaming silver, sunk deep, and the flesh around it was smoking. Actually smoking, turning black and charred, as though the metal itself were burning him alive from the inside out. The water around him ran dark with blood, and his eyes found hers. They were not the eyes of a beast. They were a deep, piercing, impossible sapphire blue, and they held something that made her chest ache, an old, tired, tragic sort of dignity. The look of a king who has fought his whole life and finally understands that he is going to lose. He was slipping. His great paws couldn't find purchase on the ice. He was going under, and this time he would not come back up. Behind her, the 11 wolves let out a sound she would never forget as long as she lived. A low, collective, keening whine, grief, pure grief. They were watching their king drown. No, Elowen said. The word tore out of her raw throat before her mind had even agreed to it. Not after all this, not one more. She had already lost no. She would not lose him too. She unhitched herself from the anchor tree, which was madness. She knew it was madness even as her hands did it. Because the rope was the only thing keeping her from the water, and the water was death. And she was untying herself from her one lifeline to crawl out onto ice that was already cracking. But there wasn't enough rope to reach him. And there wasn't enough time to find another way. And there was something in those sapphire eyes she could not, would not turn her back on. So she dropped to her belly, spread her weight across the fracturing ice, and she crawled. The ice sank beneath her, a spiderweb of white lines racing out from under her body. She heard it. She ignored it. She reached the edge where the black water churned, and she plunged both bare, bleeding arms straight down into the sub-zero dark. The pain was instant, blinding. A white-hot scream of cold, so total it felt like her flesh was being scraped from the bone. Her vision went to sparks. Her fingers found the thick scruff of his neck. The Titan groaned a sound she felt in her teeth, in her spine, in the roots of her hair. And then he stopped moving. He had nothing left, no strength to help her. He was dead weight now, 600, 800, 1,000 pounds of sinking king. And Elowen was one freezing woman with torn hands and no anchor. And she was not strong enough. She knew she was not strong enough. "Help me," she sobbed. To the sky, to the dark, to no one at all. "Please, somebody help me." And somebody did. She felt it before she understood it. A sudden, massive pressure at her waist. The 11th wolf. The scarred brute. He had stepped onto the solid edge of the bank, clamped his enormous jaws around the trailing end of her abandoned rope, and thrown himself backward, pulling with the full weight of his body. Then the silver female joined him, teeth in the rope. Then the twins. Then the gray. Then all of them. All 11, seizing the line in their jaws and hauling as one a living winch. A pack of monsters bending every ounce of what was left in their frozen bodies to save the woman who had saved them. Elowen felt the king shift. She got both arms deep, buried them in that soaked fur to the shoulder, and she pulled with a final, bone-cracking, soul-emptying heave that she was certain would be the last thing she ever did. And the Titan came free of the river's black mouth. The ice under her gave way completely in the same instant. She dropped, but the wolves were already moving. The silver female lunged, caught the hood of her cloak in her teeth, and dragged her back onto solid snow, out of the water, beside the great unconscious body of the king. And then Elowen just stopped. She lay in the snow, coughing, her vision fraying at the edges into black. She was freezing to death. She knew it with the calm, clinical certainty her father had drilled into her. Get to heat now, or don't see the dawn. Except there was no heat. There was only snow, and dark, and the long slide down into the cold. She closed her eyes. And here, right here, is where the first strange thing happened. The first of many. The thing she would tell no one, because no one would have believed her. Warmth. Sudden, impossible warmth wrapping around her like a blanket pulled from a fire. She forced her eyes open. The wolves had moved. The 11 of them had risen on shaking legs and pressed their massive bodies into a wall around her and their fallen king, both packing tight, shoulder to shoulder, shielding the two of them from the killing wind. And the heat coming off them was extraordinary, unnatural. Like lying down inside a hearth. It stopped her shivering, pushed the color back into her cheeks. It pulled her, breath by breath, back from the edge she'd been sliding toward. The pack she had rescued was now saving her. And Elowen, Ashcroft, who had stopped expecting kindness from anything that walked or crawled or breathed, lay in a fortress of living fur with a dying king at her side, and she wept, silently, from somewhere very deep, for a reason she couldn't have named if you'd asked her. She lay there an hour, maybe more, while the storm howled itself out. Then she stood, because the Titan was still dying. His breath came shallow and rattling. That silver wound wept black. And Elowen, warm now, alive now, looked at the 11 wolves surrounding her and said the words as if they could understand her. We have to move him. And to her absolute astonishment, they did understand. She fetched her father's great logging sled from the top of the ridge, the one built to haul oak, and two of the largest black wolves put their massive snouts against the king's flank and pushed while she pulled. And together, a frail human woman and a pack of impossible monsters, they rolled the Titan onto the sled. The journey home was a thing out of a fever dream. One small woman and 11 mythic beasts, moving in perfect, silent procession through the last of the blizzard, hauling their dying sovereign across the snow. When they reached the cottage, the wolves crowded the porch and blocked the wind with their bodies. Only the scarred brute and the silver female helped her drag the king inside, where his enormous frame took up the whole of the braided rug before her stone hearth. And then Elowen went to work. She stoked the fire until the room roared. She fetched her father's old surgical tools, the heavy iron pliers, the jars of dried comfrey and wintergreen, and a rare, bitter root Coran had kept locked in a cedar box, a root he'd once told her could draw poison from a wound when nothing else on earth would. She'd never asked him where he learned that. She wished now that she had. The silver bolt was pure malice. She could smell the burning flesh, sweet and awful. She laid one gentle, bleeding hand against the Titan's massive, soft ear. "This is going to hurt," she whispered. He couldn't hear her. She knew that. She said it anyway. She gripped the bolt with the pliers, braced a knee against that enormous chest, and she pulled. The Titan erupted. Even unconscious, the agony drove a roar out of him that shook the iron pots from the ceiling hooks and sent his great claws gouging deep furrows into her floorboards. The force of it threw her backward across the room. She held on, she came back, set her knee again, pulled again, and with a wet, sickening tear, the silver bolt came free. She flung it into the fire, where it hissed like a living thing. She packed the wound with her father's bitter paste, bound it tight in clean linen round and round that massive torso, and by the time she finished, she was drenched in sweat and dirt and the dark blood of a king, and the black veins that had been crawling out from the wound had begun, slowly, to recede. Outside, the 11 wolves let out a low, collective hum. Relief. She felt it through the walls. Elowen sank down beside the hearth. Beside him, inches away from a beast that could have killed her with a thought. And she was too far past exhaustion to be afraid. She rested her head against his massive flank, laid one torn hand over his great, steady, beating heart. And she slept. Hours passed. The blizzard died. The world went white and silent and still. And when the first pale light of dawn crept through her frost-rimed windows, Elowen began to stir. Something was wrong. The smell was wrong. The heavy, comforting scent of wet fur and wild animal gone. In its place, something else filled the cabin. Sharp, clean. The smell of ancient pine and cold iron and something distinctly, undeniably human. Her head was no longer pillowed on fur. It was resting against something warm. Solid, smooth, skin. Elowen bolted upright and her heart slammed against her ribs. The wolves were gone. The cabin was full but not with animals. Standing in a rigid, silent half-circle around her small living room were 11 towering men. Enormous, coated with muscle, wrapped in nothing but scraps of fur and salvaged blankets, and every one of them watching her with an expression of such fierce, solemn reverence that she scrambled backward until her spine hit the cold stone of the hearth. And on her cot, in the corner, the cot she had somehow levered him onto in the night, with her pulleys and her stubbornness lay a man. Breathtakingly massive, a chest like an anvil mapped with old battle scars, a wild mane of midnight black hair, streaked with shocks of white at the temples, and wrapped around one broad shoulder, the bloody linen she had tied there herself only hours ago. His eyes opened, sapphire blue, the same eyes, the exact same eyes she had seen rising out of the black water. And the 11 men in her cabin dropped to one knee as one, bowing their heads in terrible, perfect unison. The man on the cot looked down at his bandaged shoulder, then at the dried blood still crusted on Elowen's torn hands, then slowly up into her face. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough and rich with a power that made the air itself feel heavy. "You saved my pack, little bird." Elowen couldn't move, couldn't breathe. "And you pulled the sovereign of the northern brood back through the gates of death." The faintest, most dangerous smile touched his mouth. "Tell me, what is a human girl to do with an alpha king?" She had no answer, because there wasn't one, not yet. But there was one more thing, one more impossible thing, and it came to her slowly, the way the worst and best things always do, as the man's sapphire gaze held hers, and something ancient stirred behind it. Some flicker of memory older than that morning, older than the river, older than her. "I know you," he said quietly, almost to himself, almost wondering. "I have known you a very long time, little bird. Longer than you could guess." And Elowen, who had stopped expecting kindness from the world, who had buried her father under the oak and lived alone at the end of everything, felt the floor of her whole life tilt beneath her. Because 16 winters ago, when she was a child of 8, her father Coran had come home from the deep woods with blood on his hands and a strange, haunted look on his face. And when she asked him what had happened, he had knelt down and taken her small hands in his great ones, and told her something she had not thought about in years. "I found a wolf pup today," he'd said, "caught in a trap that wasn't mine. Terrible thing, a silver trap meant to kill," and his voice had gone soft and strange. "The men who set it wanted it dead. But there are some orders, Elowen, that a good man does not follow. Do you understand me? No matter the cost." She hadn't understood. Not then. She was beginning to understand now, because the man on her cot was looking at her the way you look at a face you have carried in your memory for half your life. And when he spoke again, his rough voice had gone almost gentle. "Your father let me go," Torrance said, "when I was small and caught and meant to die. He took the trap off my leg with his own hands and he let me run." Something moved across that scarred, powerful face. "I swore that day that I would repay the debt. I did not know it would take 16 years. I did not know it would be his daughter pulling me from the ice." The fire crackled. The 11 men knelt, and outside, in the pristine and terrible silence of the new-fallen snow, something shifted at the distant tree line. Something that had followed the drag marks of a wooden sled all the way from the gorge. Something with black iron and consecrated silver and no mercy at all. But Elowen didn't know that yet. For one more moment, all she knew was this, that the kindness her father had planted in the dark 16 winters ago had come walking back out of a frozen river to save her life. And that nothing would ever be the same again. Then, far off, sharp as a snapped bone in the frozen air, came the twang of a ballista. And the first iron bolt tore through the morning. The bolt tore through the front wall of the cottage and buried itself in the hearthstone, a hand's width from Elowen's head. Stone dust rained down, and the whole world snapped back into motion at once. The 11 kneeling men were on their feet before she'd even finished flinching. Not scrambling, not panicking. Rising the way a wave rises, smooth, inevitable, and utterly terrifying to be standing in front of. The scarred brute she'd hauled from the water moved to the shattered wall and put one enormous hand flat against the wood, listening. "East tree line," he said, "low 20, maybe more. Silver, That was the king, Torren. Already sitting up on the cot, one hand pressed to his bandaged shoulder, his sapphire eyes gone hard and cold as the river that had nearly killed him. The scarred man's jaw tightened. Silver, he confirmed. And something in the room dropped. A temperature. A hope. Elowen didn't understand it yet, but she would. She was on her feet too, her back still against the hearth. Her mind doing that thing it did in a crisis, going very quiet, very fast, sorting the room into what could save her and what could get her killed. Because that was how she'd stayed alive out here for 24 years. Not by being brave, by being quick. Who are they? She said. Nobody answered. Which, if you've ever been the only person in a room who doesn't know why everyone else has gone pale, you'll understand is its own particular kind of horror. Who are they? She said again, sharper. Torren rose from the cot, and even wounded, even swaying, he unfolded to a height that made the low ceiling of her cottage feel like a child's dollhouse. He towered. He filled the space. And when he looked at her, there was something almost like apology in it. They are hunters, he said, and they are here for me. Now, here's the thing about Elowen Ashcroft that the men in her cabin didn't know yet. She had spent her whole life being told what she couldn't understand. Too wild, too strange. A woman alone at the end of the world, surely too fragile for the truth of things. Her father had been the only one who ever spoke to her plain, and she had buried her father under the oak. So, when this enormous, impossible, half-dead king stood in her home and gave her 4 soft words, instead of the truth, something in her went flint. No, she said, you don't get to do that. Torren blinked. Do what? That. She jabbed a finger at him, at the whole gathered pack of them, blood still on her hands from saving their lives. That gentle little half-answer you give to someone you think can't take the real one. I dragged 12 of you out of a frozen river last night. I pulled a silver bolt out of your shoulder with my father's pliers while you screamed loud enough to wake the dead. I have earned the whole truth. So give it to me now. Fast. Before whoever's out there puts a bolt through both of us. Silence. And then, and she would think about this later, would turn it over in her mind for a long time, Torren smiled. Not the dangerous one from before. A different one. Slower. Surprised. Something that looked almost like respect breaking across that scarred and ancient face. Corran's daughter, murmured the scarred man from the wall. Of course she is. The whole truth, Elowen said again. So Torren gave it to her. Fast, like she asked. In the time it took the hunters at the tree line to reload. The pack was the northern brood. Old blood, older than the kingdoms, older than the maps. They held the deep forests under an ancient accord, the timber, the silver veins in the mountains, the high passes that any army would kill to control. And someone at last had decided to stop asking politely. His name is Malric Crane, Torren said, and the name came out of him like something spat from a wound. A lord with an appetite and no soul to slow it down. He wants the forest, all of it, and to take it he must take us first. So he hunts you, Elowen said. So he hunts us, Torren agreed, with silver bolts and consecrated blades and men who fear nothing, because he pays them enough to forget how. His hand tightened on his shoulder. We were ambushed in the past 3 nights ago, driven herded, like deer onto the ice of the Blackwater. He knew it would break. He knew we would drown. Except you didn't, Elowen said. Except a wild woman with a rope came down the embankment, said the scarred man, when every sane creature in the world would have run the other way. Elowen looked at him. What's your name? Bracken, he said. And the silver, she said, because her mind was already 3 steps ahead, already at the terrible edge of the thing nobody wanted to say out loud. Why does it matter so much? You were the size of horses. A blade is a blade. And that was when Torren told her the last piece. The worst one. Because we cannot change, he said quietly. The silver is in our blood now, all of us. From the water, from the wound. Until it passes, the wolf is locked away. We cannot shift. We cannot heal the way we should. He met her eyes. Out there is an army built to kill monsters. And in here are 11 exhausted men and a king who can barely stand. Not one wolf among us. The room understood before Elowen's mouth did. They were going to fight Malric Crane's silver hunters. As men, as tired, freezing, ordinary men, and they were going to lose. Now, you'd think, wouldn't you, that this is the part where the small human woman goes quiet in the corner and lets the warriors handle it, where she wrings her hands and waits to be protected. You'd be wrong, because Elowen Ashcroft had not survived 24 winters at the end of the world by waiting to be protected, and because standing in front of her, bleeding and doomed and far too proud to say so, was the pack that had shielded her body with their own in the snow. When she was dying, the first living things in longer than she could remember, to treat her like she was worth saving. She wasn't going to let them die on her floor. She crossed the room. Fast, threw back the braided rug where the Titan had lain all night, and underneath, set into the floorboards, was a heavy iron ring. Torren watched her, something unreadable in his eyes. She hauled the ring. A trapdoor came up with a groan, and cold air breathed out of the dark below. My father was Corran Ashcroft, Elowen said, and there was iron in her voice now, the same iron that had been in his. Before they exiled him, before they took everything, he was the master of the hunt for the High Lords, and a man like that does not come to the end of the world empty-handed. She pointed down into the black. That cellar is full of cold steel and heavy crossbows, blades that never saw a battle, bows still waxed and true. She looked up at 11 of the most dangerous creatures on the continent, and she did not flinch. If you're going to fight as men, then you'll fight armed. Get down there now. For a long moment nobody moved, and Elowen thought, with a lurch of pure panic, oh no, I've done it now. I've given orders to a king, to a whole pack of monster kings. And any second now one of them is going to remind me exactly what I am, which is a woman with torn up hands and a big mouth and absolutely no business. Torren laughed. Low, rough, genuine. It rolled up out of that anvil chest and filled the ruined cabin, and every man in the room seemed to breathe again at the sound of it. Corran's daughter, he said, shaking his head slowly. Wonder and something warmer moving under the words. The Fates have a cruel sense of humor, and a fine one. He nodded to his men. You heard the lady. Arm yourselves. And they went. Because, and this is the thing Elowen only understood later, lying awake, turning the whole strange day over, a true king is not the one who gives every order. A true king is the one who knows a good order when he hears it, and who is not too proud to follow a wild woman down into her father's cellar when she's right. They armed. Broadswords and throwing axes and heavy crossbows hauled up out of the dark and into the gray dawn light. And while they did, Torren stood near the hearth with a battle axe in his good hand, watching Elowen move through the ruin of her home with the sharp economy of someone who had survived a great deal. You're not what I expected, he said. Nobody ever expects me, Elowen said, not looking up from the crossbow she was checking. That's rather the point. Your father. Torren's voice softened. Did he tell you? About the pup in the trap? And Elowen's hand stilled on the crossbow. Because he had. 16 winters ago, a wolf pup in a silver trap that wasn't his to spring, and an order a good man wouldn't follow, no matter the cost. She'd thought it was a story. She was standing in it now. He told me, she said quietly. I didn't know it was real. It was real. Torren's sapphire eyes held hers across the wrecked room. Your father saved a creature the world had already sentenced to death. He asked for nothing. He never came looking for thanks. A pause. And now here you are, his daughter, doing the same thing, as if it runs in the blood. Elowen didn't answer that. Because she couldn't. Because something was rising in her throat that she had no name for. And there wasn't time for it. There was never time for it, and outside, the crunch of heavy boots on frozen snow was getting louder. They were coming. She lifted her father's crossbow. braced it against her shoulder the way he'd taught her all those years ago, before the world went cold. Later, she said, you can tell me the rest later. If we live. If we live, Torren agreed. And then the first wave hit. The front door blew inward off its hinges, and the morning filled with the roar of men and steel. What happened next happened fast, and Elowen would only ever remember it in pieces. The pack surging out into the snow like an avalanche of muscle and fury unable to shift. Yes, but still carrying every ounce of a predator's speed, a predator's savagery, poured now into human hands wrapped around human steel. Bracken, wading into the mercenary line, shattering iron armor with each swing of his blade. A figure she didn't yet know moving through the chaos like a dancer, twin daggers, finding every gap in every guard. And Elowen at the shattered window, crossbow steady, hands that did not shake. She saw a hunter level a heavy weapon at Bracken's exposed back. She exhaled, squeezed, and put a bolt through the man's shoulder before he could fire, dropping him into the red snow. Bracken half turned, found her in the window, and gave her a single sharp nod, the nod of one hunter to another, one killer's respect for another's aim. She'd never had that before, from anyone. She filed it away for later, the way she filed everything away for later, and she reloaded. They were winning. That was the terrible, dangerous, seductive thing. For a few wild minutes, against every law of sense and numbers, they were winning. The traps her father had built and she had maintained snapped shut beneath the snow, hoisting men into the air by their ankles, dropping oak logs on the ones who broke through. The pack tore into the rest. And Elowen picked off the stragglers from her window with a steady hand and a cold heart. Which is exactly when it went wrong. Because a good general always holds something back. The side wall of the cottage exploded inward. A mercenary the size of a doorframe smashed through the timber, iron mace already swinging, eyes wild and empty. And Elowen mid-reload, crossbow open, and useless in her hands had nowhere to go. She saw the mace coming. She thought, absurdly, clearly, in the strange slow time of almost dying. Well, that's the whole story then. That's how it ends. A wild woman in a broken house. And then a shadow swallowed the light. Torren. He crossed the room faster than something his size had any right to move. Dropped his axe. Put his own body between Elowen and the mace, and the iron caught him full in the chest. A blow that would have shattered any human ribcage into powder. He did not fall. He did not even flinch. He retouched with one hand, closed it around the mercenary's throat, lifted the man clean off his feet, and with a sound Elowen felt in her own bones ended it, then tossed the body through the broken wall like something the wind had blown in. Silence rushed back into the room. Outside, the last of Crane's hunters were breaking, fleeing into the deep woods, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead in the red snow. It was over. For now. And Elowen stood in the wreck of her father's house, crossbow hanging from her numb fingers, staring at the enormous king who had just taken a killing blow meant for her and hadn't so much as staggered. She started. I'm fine, Torren said. You are not fine. You took a mace to the little bird. And there it was again, that slow smile, gentler than anything she'd have believed a creature like him capable of. I have taken worse, from worse. He looked down at her torn hands, her white face, her father's crossbow. But no one, he said quietly, has ever pulled me out of a river to do it. Elowen looked away, because she didn't know what to do with that, with any of it, with a whole pack of monsters who bowed to her, and a king who took blows for her, and the slow, unfamiliar, frightening warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing at all to do with the fire. She had built her whole life around not needing anyone. And in the space of one night and one morning, that whole life was coming apart at the seams. So she did what she always did when the feelings got too big. She got practical. They'll be back, she said, turning to survey the ruin of her home. Crane. He doesn't seem like the sort of man who loses gracefully. "He isn't," said a new voice, and Elowen turned, the dancer, the one who had moved through the battle like water, twin daggers flashing. Now she stood in the doorway, chest heaving, blood on her blades that wasn't her own, and Elowen saw, for the first time, that the dancer was a woman. Tall, sharp-featured, watchful in a way that went past a warrior's watchfulness into something older and more careful. A woman who had spent a long time noticing exits. "Sorsha," Torrent said by way of introduction. "My finest blade." "Your king is right," Sorsha said. Her eyes were on Elowen, steady and strange. "Crane doesn't lose gracefully, and he doesn't lose quietly." A pause. "He'll come himself next time. He'll want to look you in the eye." "Me?" Elowen said. "Why me? I'm nobody. I'm a woman in a cottage at the end of the—" "You pulled the Northern King out of a grave he built with his own gold," Sorsha said. "By now every ear he owns has carried word of it back to him." Her gaze flicked briefly to Torren, then back. "Trust me, he knows your name." And something in the way she said it, something in that flick of the eyes, that half-beat of hesitation made the hair on Elowen's arms stand up. But she was tired, and her home was in ruins, and there were bodies in the snow and a king in her doorway. So she filed it away, for later. She was always filing things away for later. She would come to regret that. They spent the day rebuilding what they could, boarding the broken walls, dragging the dead to the edge of the wood. And through it all, the pack moved around Elowen with a care that unsettled her more than any threat could have, bringing her water, wrapping her ruined hands in clean linen, one of the twins silently laying his own fur cloak over her shoulders when the wind picked up. She didn't know what to do with kindness. She'd been out of practice for so long. That night, they crowded into the cottage against the cold, 11 warriors and a king and a wild woman. And for the first time in more years than she could count, Elowen Ashcroft was not alone in the dark. She lay by the hearth, listening to them breathe, and she thought about her father, about the pup in the trap, about a good man who did a good thing in secret and expected nothing for it, and how that quiet kindness had come walking back out of a river 16 winters later to save his daughter's life. As if it runs in the blood, Torren had said. She didn't sleep much, and so she was awake, near dawn, when she heard the sound from the corner. Soft, careful, the sound of someone trying very hard not to be heard. Elowen lay still. Sorsha. The warrior woman had risen in the dark and crossed to Elowen's father's cedar chest, the one where the herbs were kept, and the surgical tools, and the old journals in Coran's cramped hand that Elowen had never quite been able to bring herself to read. Sorsha was going through them, quickly, quietly, looking for something, and Elowen's heart began to pound. Because there was only one reason a person searches your dead father's things in the dark while she thinks you're sleeping. And it isn't a kind one. She should have said something, sat up, called out, except she didn't, because there was something in Sorsha's face, lit blue by the dying embers, that stopped her cold. Not greed, not malice, grief. The woman was crying, silently, tears running down that sharp, watchful face as she paged through the journals of a dead huntsman, searching for something she was terrified to find. And Elowen, who knew that particular grief, who had felt it in her own chest every day for years, the grief of loving someone the world took from you. Elowen held her breath and watched, and did not understand. Not yet, but the pieces were there now, in the dark, waiting. A warrior who searched a dead man's things and wept. A lord who knew a wild woman's name, a father's journals never read, and a dead 16 winters deep that was only just beginning to come due. Sorsha found a folded paper pressed between the pages. She read it once in the ember light. Her face crumpled, and she pressed it to her chest and bowed her head and wept without a sound. Then she slipped the paper into her tunic, closed the chest with the softest click, and went back to her place among the sleeping pack as if she had never moved at all. Elowen lay in the dark a long time after that, watching the corner where Sorsha slept. thinking about all the things she'd filed away for later, and feeling, for the first time since the eyes screamed, that later was going to arrive a great deal sooner than she was ready for. 'Cause outside, beyond the boarded walls, beyond the red snow and the tree line and the frozen miles, a lord with an appetite and no soul to slow it down was already saddling his horse. And this time he was coming himself. He came at midday, under a white flag, which, if you know anything about men like Malric Crane, is somehow worse than coming with swords. Elowen saw him from the boarded window. One rider, picking his way up the snow-choked path to her ruined cottage, alone, unhurried, a scrap of white cloth tied to a raised lance. Behind him at the tree line a dark mass waited, 50 men, 60. She stopped counting, and Torren beside her at the window went very still. "He wants to talk," Elowen said. "He wants to look at you," Torren said quietly. Sorsha was right. He's curious now. A wild woman who pulls kings from rivers. His jaw tightened. Curiosity in a man like Crane is more dangerous than his whole army. "Then I won't give him the satisfaction," Elowen said, reaching for her crossbow. Torren's hand closed over hers, gentle, immovable. "You'll give him nothing," he agreed, "but you'll hear him. Because a man who wants to talk is a man who has something to lose. And I'd very much like to know what it is." So they opened the door, and Malric Crane rode into the wreckage of her father's yard and got a look at Elowen Ashcroft and smiled. He was not what she expected. She'd built a monster in her mind, something with fangs and fire. But the man who swung down off his horse was almost ordinary, middle-aged, handsomely dressed in dark wool and silver clasps. A face that would have been kind if you didn't look too long at the eyes, which were the flat, patient eyes of a man who has never in his life been told no and meant it. "So," he said, and his voice was warm, pleasant, awful. "The huntsman's daughter. I confess I had to see it for myself." Elowen said nothing. "Do you know," Crane went on, strolling through her yard as if he owned it, as if the bodies of his own men hadn't lain there a day before, "I knew your father, Coran Ashcroft, master of the hunt." He clicked his tongue. "A tragedy. What happened to him? Exiled, ruined, forgotten. And for what? A single act of disobedience." He turned those flat eyes on her. "Doesn't seem fair, does it? That a good man's whole family should freeze at the end of the world. That his daughter should be reduced to this." And Elowen felt it the hook, sliding in. Because he wasn't wrong. That was the terrible thing. None of it had been fair. "Come with me," Crane said softly. "That's all. Come back to the world of men, where you belong. I'll restore your father's name, your lands, your title. You'll never be cold again. You'll never be alone again." A pause. "All you have to do is walk away from these animals. And tell me where their king sleeps." Silence. The wind moved through the broken yard, and Elowen Ashcroft looked at Malric Crane, at his kind face, and his patient eyes, and his warm, poisoned voice, and she understood something with total, crystalline clarity. This was the man the world called civilized. And the creatures he wanted her to betray were the ones who had shielded her with their own bodies in the snow to keep her alive. "You knew my father," she said. "I did. Then you should know better." Her voice was very quiet, very steady. "He didn't refuse that order because he was foolish. He refused it because some things are worth more than a title. And I would rather freeze at the end of the world as his daughter than sit warm at your table as your dog." Crane's smile didn't waver, but something moved behind the eyes. Something cold. "Pity," he said, and he swung back up onto his horse. "I did try to do this kindly. Remember that later. Remember that I offered you the warm road first." He looked past her then, at Torren, filling the doorway. "You should have stayed drowned," Crane told him pleasantly. "It would have been gentler than what's coming." Then he wheeled his horse and rode back toward the tree line and the dark mass of his army. And Elowen watched him go with her heart pounding and a cold certainty settling into her bones. He'd given her until nightfall. He'd said it like a courtesy. Give up the king, or the whole valley burns. Now, I want you to understand what Elwen was facing, because it matters for what comes next. 11 warriors and a king who could not become wolves. A cottage with 2 walls boarded and 2 walls broken. Against 60 silver hunters and a lord who had already proven he'd drown a whole pack rather than fight it fair. The math didn't work. Everyone in that cottage knew the math didn't work. And that was when Sorsha stood up. She'd been quiet all day, quieter than usual even. Sitting apart, one hand pressed to her chest, where Elowen suddenly remembered a folded paper lay hidden in her tunic. And now she stood, in the center of the room, in front of her king, and her sharp face was pale as milk. "There's something you have to know," Sorsha said, "before tonight. Because after tonight I may not get the chance to say it." Torren turned to her, and Sorsha told them, fast, like tearing off a bandage, like a wound she'd carried too long. She had not always been of the pack. Years ago, she'd been Crane's, one of his silver hunters, placed among the northern brood as a spy, sent to learn their movements, their weaknesses, the paths through the deep wood. Everything a man like Crane would need to drive a pack of monsters onto breaking ice. The ambush at the Blackwater, the trap that nearly drowned them all. She had helped set it. The room went utterly silent. 11 warriors and a king, staring at the woman who had betrayed them into a frozen grave. "I helped him herd you onto that ice," Sorsha said, and her voice didn't shake, though everything else about her did. "I gave him the pass. I gave him the timing. I did everything he asked." Her eyes were bright and terrible. "And then I watched you drown. And I watched a human woman, a stranger, who owed you nothing, come down that embankment and pull you out one by one, with her bare hands while I stood in the trees and did nothing." She turned to Elowen. "You didn't know me. You didn't owe me a thing. And you nearly died a dozen times in that water for creatures the whole world calls monsters." Her breath hitched. "And I thought, what does that make me? What have I been? All these years that a wild woman at the end of the world has more honor in her torn-up hands than I have in my whole life." Nobody moved. Bracken's hand had drifted to his blade. His face was stone. And Elowen understood at last the grief she'd seen in the dark. A woman searching a dead man's journals. A woman weeping over pages she had no right to. "The chest," Elowen said softly. "My father's journals. What were you looking for?" Sorsha reached into her tunic, drew out the folded paper, and held it out not to Torren but to Elowen. "Proof," she whispered, "that I wasn't wrong to change." Elowen took it, unfolded it, and there, in her father's cramped and careful hand, was a page she had never read, because she'd never been able to bring herself to open his journals at all. It was about the pup in the trap, but it was more than that. Because Coran Ashcroft had written down, 16 winters ago, what the world's cruelty had cost him, and what one act of mercy in a dark wood had bought. He'd written that the northern brood were not beasts, that he'd looked into the eyes of a wolf pup, meant for slaughter, and seen something that looked back, something that understood. And he'd written the words that undid Elowen completely. Standing there in the ruin of the home he'd left her. "The measure of a soul is not whether it walks on 2 legs or 4. It is whether, when it holds power over the helpless, it chooses mercy. I could not save my name, but I could save this small life. And I think in the end that is the better trade." Elowen's hands shook, because her father had known. All along, he'd known what he was, and what he'd done and why. And he'd left it here for her to find, folded in a book she was too afraid of grief to open. "He was trying to tell me," she whispered, "even after he was gone. He was trying to tell me who to be." And Sorsha, the spy, the traitor, the woman with more blood on her hands than any of them, Sorsha dropped to one knee in front of her king. "I can't undo what I did," she said, "but I know Crane. I know how he fights. I know where he'll place his men, and when he'll send them, and the one thing in this world he's afraid of." She lifted her head. "Let me give you that." Let me be, for one night, the thing that wild woman's father believed we could be. And if I die tonight, let me die on the right side of it. The silence stretched. Bracken's hand stayed on his blade. And then Torren, who had every reason to tear her apart, who had drowned in the water she'd helped freeze, Torren reached down and lifted her to her feet. My father used to say, the king murmured, that the pack is not who you are born beside. It's who you choose to stand beside, when standing costs you everything. He looked at her a long moment. You could have run tonight. You chose to confess instead. That's a choice, Sorsha. That's the only thing that's ever mattered. He turned to Elowen. What do you say, little bird? It's your house, she searched in the dark. Your father's grief she wept over, and every eye in the room turned to Elowen Ashcroft, the wild woman, the outcast, the last of her line, being asked for the first time in her life to decide the worth of another human soul. She thought about her father, about mercy in a dark wood, about the better trade. Stand with us, Elowen said, and we'll call it even. Sorsha wept, and they made their plan. Night fell like a held breath. Crane came exactly when Sorsha said he would, exactly how she said he would, his men fanning out through the eastern tree line, torches doused, moving low and quiet through the deep snow toward the cottage that held their prize. And walking straight into the ground, Elowen had spent the whole afternoon preparing, because a huntsman's daughter knows the land the way a lord never can. The first line of hunters hit the pit traps and vanished into the dark with screams. The second line met the snares her father had built, and she had kept for 24 years, and were hoisting into the trees by their ankles before they understood what was happening. And into that confusion, into that chaos of falling men and swinging torches, the pack fell like the wrath of God. Sorsha led them. She knew every man out there, knew their names, their fears, the gaps in their armor. She moved through Crane's hunters like a woman settling a debt, twin daggers flashing, and beside her Bracken carved a path through the silver line with an axe and a fury 16 winters in the making. And Elowen was everywhere, not hidden, not protected. In the thick of it, her father's crossbow steady against her shoulder, dropping every hunter who leveled a weapon at a friend. She'd stopped thinking of them as monsters somewhere in the last 2 days. Somewhere between the frozen river and the folded page. They were her pack now. She didn't know when it had happened. She only knew it had. They were winning again that terrible, seductive, false dawn of almost victory when the tide turned. Because Crane had learned. His men had silver, and they used it. Not on the wolves were already men, already grounded, but on Elowen. A bolt caught her in the side, punched through, spun her into the snow. And another hunter was on her before she could rise, his blade high, and Torren was too far, and Bracken was too far. And this was how the story ended after all. She saw the blade fall, and she made a choice. Because there was one thing Sorsha had told them. One thing Crane feared above all others. One secret the Northern Brood had guarded for 1,000 years. One reason the silver worked at all. The blood of the Accord Keepers. The old human bloodline sworn to the pack in ages past. The line that could break the silver's hold if the blood was freely given. The Ashcroft line. Her father hadn't just spared a pup in a trap. He'd been one of them, all along, the last Accord Keeper. And he'd never told her, because he'd wanted her to have a normal life, a safe life, a life at the end of the world where no lord would ever come hunting. Except a lord had come hunting anyway. And his daughter was lying in the snow, with a bolt in her side and a blade coming down. So Elowen Ashcroft dragged her skinning knife across her own palm, and pressed her bleeding hand flat against the frozen ground, and gave. What happened next, the survivors would speak of for 100 years, because the snow around her hand went dark, and a pulse deep, silent, older than the mountains, rolled out from her palm across the whole battlefield, and every wolf in the Northern Brood felt it hit their poisoned blood like sunrise. the silver broke. And the men, the 11 exhausted men and their wounded king, became what they truly were. Torren rose out of the snow as the Titan again, black and frost and terrible glory, twice the size of any horse, the crossbow scar still raw on his shoulder, his sapphire eyes blazing. Bracken beside him, and Sorsha, and all of them, the whole pack, restored in a single heartbeat by the blood of a wild woman who'd chosen. One last time, mercy over safety. Crane's hunters ran. There was nothing else to do. You do not stand and fight a pack of unleashed monsters. You run and you pray and mostly you die anyway. And in the center of it all, Torren the Titan stood over Elowen's fallen body and lowered his massive head and pressed his nose against her bleeding hand and made a sound no one had ever heard a king make. Low, broken, pleading. Live, it said. Please live. She lived. Of course she lived. Because the blood that broke the silver ran both ways, and where her hand had touched the earth, where she'd given everything, something gave back. The wound in her side closed. The color came back to her face. And she opened her eyes in the red snow to find a monster the size of a house pressing his forehead to hers with the desperate tenderness of a creature who has just understood too late exactly what he almost lost. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." And that left only Crane. They found him at the tree line, cut off from his fleeing men, his fine wool torn and his patient eyes finally afraid. Torren advanced on him across the snow, huge and slow and inevitable, and Crane fell backward and raised one trembling hand. "Mercy," Malric, Crane said. The word came out of him like something rotten. Mercy, and Torren stopped. Because here is the whole story, the real one, the one underneath all the ice and blood. The Titan stood over the man who had drowned his pack, who had hunted him with silver, who had tried to burn a whole valley to the ground and reduce a good man's daughter to a traitor. Torren could have ended it in a single motion. Every creature watching expected him to. Part of Elowen, God help her, wanted him to. And Torren looked back at her, at the wild woman in the snow who'd given her own blood to save him, whose father had chosen mercy in a dark wood 16 winters ago and started this whole long chain of grace. "Your father spared me," Torren said, "Dep to Crane, but really to her. A stranger in a trap meant to die. He asked for nothing. And that one small mercy came back 16 years later and pulled me out of a frozen river." He lowered his great head until his sapphire eyes were level with Crane's terrified ones. "I could kill you. It would be just. But I have learned something these last days from a woman who kept saving things the world told her to let die." He stepped back. "Run," the king said. "Carry it back to whoever sent you. The Northern Brood does not answer cruelty with cruelty. We are done with that. We are done drowning in it." And Malric Crane, who had never in his life been shown a mercy he did not deserve, scrambled up and fled into the dark and was gone. Which, yes, meant he lived, meant this wasn't over, meant that somewhere out there, a humiliated lord was already plotting his return, and the Accord Keeper's blood was a secret worth a kingdom, and the story would go on. But that was tomorrow's trouble. Tonight, there was only the aftermath. The pack restored, the dead mourned, and a wild woman standing in the snow of her father's yard, watching the sun come up over a valley that had not burned. Torren shifted back to the man. Wrapped in nothing but the dawn and his old scars, he crossed the snow to her, and he dropped to one knee, the king of the Northern Brood, kneeling to the huntsman's daughter, while the whole restored pack went still around them. "You saved my pack," he said. "Twice now. You gave your own blood to break a curse 1,000 years old. And you taught a king something his father tried to teach him long ago, and I was too proud to learn." His sapphire eyes lifted to hers. "Come with me to the Winter Court, Elowen Ashcroft. Not as a rescued thing, not as a prize, as my equal, as the Accord Keeper, as the woman I would follow into any frozen river in the world." And here at last was the moment, the wild woman. The outcast. The one the village called feral. The one the world forgot. The one who'd stopped expecting kindness so long ago she'd almost forgotten the shape of it. Being asked to belong. And you might think after everything that she said yes at once, that she fell into his arms as the music swelled. She didn't, because Elowen Ashcroft had spent 24 years learning to stand on her own, and she was not going to trade one cage for another, not even a golden one, not even a kind one. I don't know how to be a queen, she said. Torrance smiled. That slow, warm, breathtaking smile. Neither did I. He said, know how to be a king who chose mercy. You taught me that. We'll learn the rest together. And Elowen looked around her at Bracken, who'd nodded to her over a crossbow, at Sorsha, redeemed and weeping and free, at the whole impossible pack that had kept her alive with their own warmth in the snow, the first family she'd had since she buried her father under the oak. She thought about her father, about the pup in the trap, about the better trade. She thought he'd have liked them. He'd have liked all of them. And she understood, finally, what he'd been trying to tell her from beyond the grave, in a folded page in a book she'd been too afraid to open, that she was never meant to be alone, at the end of the world. That kindness given in the dark comes back, sometimes, when you least expect it, carrying you out of the freezing water and into the light, that it is never, never too late to be seen. All right, Elowen said, and she took the king's hand, and she pulled him to his feet, because that was who she was, the one who pulled others up. All right, together then. The sun rose over the northern marches. The valley did not burn. And a wild woman who had stopped expecting kindness from the world walked into the dawn surrounded by a pack that would have died for her, and very nearly had with her head high, and her father's blood warm in her veins, and for the first time in a very long time, a home. Somewhere out there, Malric Crane was running. The story wasn't over. But that, as they say, is a tale for another winter.